Hi everyone, this is author and philosopher Germinal Van. I hope everyone is fine, self-quarantine. I know it's difficult times for everybody, but I am adamantly convinced that this pandemic shall pass sooner or later. I ask everybody to stay strong. It's not going to last forever. I hope everyone is okay. This video is the presentation of my 12th book entitled Classical Liberalism in Africa, a Manifesto. Here's my hard copy. It's not a big book, it's a couple hundred pages. It's a pretty insightful and informative one for anyone that is interested in understanding African politics and African political philosophy. The central idea of this book basically is to explain one simple argument. Although that classical liberalism is an ideology that was generated in Europe in the 17th and 18th century with John Locke when he wrote Second Treatise of Government, this ideology was not strictly designed for Western people or for Western societies. In fact, it was designed for the individual. And there are empirical evidence to substantiate this argument. One, we have Japan, which is probably one of the wealthiest non-Western societies in the world. Japanese people, as I said, are not Western people, yet they have applied some elements of classical liberalism. And those elements that they have applied have enabled Japan to prosper politically, economically, and socially. Politically, Japan has the rule of law, a quintessential element for any modern civil society to thrive. Japan has applied economic freedom, capitalism, private property. Japan also has civil liberties. The Japanese citizen has individual rights. Of course, it does not mean that all of the sudden Japanese people became Western. They still have the culture. They still speak Japanese. They respect the cultural characteristics of their society. But they have applied these elements of classical liberalism, which have helped Japan to become an industrial, advanced nation in the world. It's the same with Hong Kong. Although Hong Kong is not a country per se and it's populated by Chinese people, Hong Kong is the freest territorial society in the world according to the Economic Freedom Index by the Heritage Foundation. So that is to say that when we speak of classical liberalism, it's not a Western byproduct. Why? It's because liberalism, to start with, liberalism is basically the freedom of the individual. Liberalism started with questioning authority, because in Europe, before liberalism became the dominant idea, it was the monarchy. All major European societies have monarchs all around. They have monarchs, and they were also ruled by the church. But when the monarch and the church decide upon a policy, the people used to not question if the effects of the policy will benefit them or harm them. And then you have people like John Locke and Descartes. First of all, Descartes started with saying, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So that's where now the individual start thinking for himself. What the leader is deciding, is it going to benefit me? Is it going to benefit my community? Or is it going to benefit society as a whole? And then John Locke now wrote Second Treatise of Government to enhance that idea of the freedom of the individual. Basically, it stipulates that the individual does not work for the state works for the individual. The role of the state is to protect the rights of the individual, especially the right to property. And that's what nations like Japan have been doing. And I've asked myself, why Africans reject classical liberalism? What is the matter? Because we believe that it is a Western byproduct that if it comes, it's going to corrupt our people. But it's not a matter of corrupt our people. It's a matter of enhancing the freedom of the individual. I divided this book in basically three parts. The first part is the political freedom in Africa. The second part is economic freedom in Africa. And the third part is civil liberties in Africa. I'm not going to go chapter by chapter, but I will go part by part so that you will have a basic understanding of the scope of the book. So I will start with political freedom in Africa. So the main element to understand is this: how African government function. African governments are, in theory, republics. They have written constitutions with enumerated powers, what the government can do and what it cannot do. But it is important to understand that African constitutions are not similar to American Constitution. They don't have like amendments like we do have here in the United States. So the problem is that in Africa, we did not develop a constitutional personality. What does it mean? Constitutional personality is that the citizen is aware of the rights that he is entitled to. Africans are not aware of their rights. But there are many factors for that. There's like the rate of literacy that is not really high, so people don't really understand the laws and everything. But especially African leaders never wanted their people to understand the laws and have a constitutional personality. Why? Because if African citizens start to question the authority of the leader will feel threatened. His power will be threatened. So by all means, African leaders made sure that the people or the population was not educated enough to understand the basic concepts of civil society. What are the rights that the citizen is entitled to? Because African leaders don't like that. They have a paternalistic view of society. The leader is kind of like the father of society. Therefore, whatever he decides has to be executed, has to be implemented. So African leaders have been quite hostile to liberalism. That's number one. Number two, the rule of law has been an impediment in African societies because the essence of the rule of law is that everybody, no matter what your job is, whether you're a plumber, whether you're the president of the republic, everybody is subjected to the law. If you have broken the law, you are going to be held accountable for your actions. That's what the rule of law is. And we see that the rule of law works not perfectly, but at least it works quite adequately in the United States when we saw, for instance, Nixon, who resigned in 1974 because he broke the law with the tapes. He resigned, but an African president would never resign if he broke the law. So that's what tells you where the African continent stands politically. There are a lot of progress that have to be made because the countries that started to apply the rule of law are quite advanced compared to countries that do not apply the rule of law. For instance, you have Senegal, which is doing politically fine in Africa. You have Ghana. You have Nigeria, which is also doing politically fine. You have South Africa. You have Kenya. You have these countries that started to respect the rule of law. It is not completely established as a cultural characteristic in African political culture, but it is something that started to gain ground. So it is important to make the African citizen understand his basic elemental rights. because most people don't understand their rights. So that's why the authority abuse its power over the citizen on a daily basis, and they don't even realize it. The second part of this book is economic freedom. So, of course, economic freedom means that the individual has the right to undertake, he has the right to innovate, he has the right to create wealth, which means that the government does not decide for the citizen how he should create the wealth. What the government does, however, is to protect the citizen's ability to have access to property or to property rights. So it's to loosen the access to property rights so that the citizen can create wealth and economic growth. So it is astonishing to me to see that Rwanda, for instance, is one of the most advanced countries in the African continent. Rwanda in 1974 has one of the most deadly genocide ever. Ever. People killed themselves with machete. Rwanda was collapsing politically, socially, and economically. It was almost anarchy. Yet in basically 2 decades, Rwanda became one of the most economically advanced countries in Africa. Don't get me wrong, Rwanda does not have political rights yet. Kagame, at the end of the day, remains an authoritarian leader, but he gave significant economic freedom to the Rwandans to create economic growth. Property rights in Rwanda is astonishingly high. In this book, I even made some graphs so that you guys can see how property rights in Rwanda increased over time from 1997 to 2019. And the same for Kenya too. I mean, Kenya did not encounter this deadly genocide, but property rights in Kenya is significantly high too. So it shows that classical liberalism, these elements of classical liberalism have been beneficial for African people too. And the third part is civil liberties. In civil liberties, I explained that why English-speaking African countries are more advanced on every level than French-speaking African countries. I mean, it doesn't mean that every single English-speaking African country is more advanced. Of course, Liberia, for instance, is not more advanced than Ivory Coast. So, and you have Ivory Coast, which is more advanced than Sierra Leone. So, it's not a set fact that every English-speaking country in Africa is more advanced than every French-speaking country. It depends. But there's a cultural trend. English-speaking countries tend to have a decentralized view of society, and that is based on the indirect rule of the colonial administration of the Brits. The Brits tend to colonize by inducement. So instead of applying a command style, which means that it's top-bottom, the Brits basically put the local leaders of their indigenous communities in front and say, here is our agenda. You guys have your laws. We're not going to subvert your laws, but you have to follow our agenda at the end of the day. So it made it easier for English-speaking African countries after the colonization to embrace more liberalism, compared to French-speaking countries where it was more, everything was decided from Paris. So it's called the direct administration, where everything was decided from Paris. The governor or the king or the president at the time decides what every French colonies should apply. It was a command style, like the Soviet Union, the command style economy. So French-speaking African countries have troubled to embark onto democratic patterns, and it's still a relevant impediment, except for Senegal, who has done significant progress, as I said, in terms of political rights and democratic process. Even Ivory Coast still is still struggling to completely have a full democratic uh, society. When I say democratic society, it's not about people having all the freedom, it's about having democratic institutions. And so that the people can participate into the political process and hold their leaders accountable before the rule of law. So that's what I explained in this book. It's I personally believe that Africa cannot sustainably prosper if it does not use the elements of classical liberalism. I am not asking African people to all of a sudden become Europeans. No, Africans have their culture that would be never ever be those of Western people. We have our moral values, religious values that will never be those of Western people. But the rule of law, that is a universal thing. Everyone should be able to apply the rule of law. The leader of a community should be able to subject himself to the rule of law. There is nothing European about that. Granting people access to property is something that should be universal. If the man who works the earth should own that part, if you work the land, that land should be yours because you work the land. Property rights, it's essential. Because those who rule the state are human beings like you and I. They're flooded people like you and I. The rules they implement on us, they do not implement it on themselves. So that's why we do not need more government to make people prosper. We need less government. We need the government to simply do its elemental functions, which is to protect life, liberty, and property. Simple as that. This is not a European thing. It's a human nature thing. Human beings by nature are individualistic because they have needs, wants, aspirations, and goals. And each of us have different goals. My goals may not be the same as that of my sister. I'm an individual. No one owns me. I own myself. And that is one thing that is in the African culture, is that African culture is a collectivist culture. So we believe that the individual owes everything to the community. I am not saying that to nothing collectively. The collective is important. But in order to serve your community, you need to make sure that you fulfill your needs in order to contribute your needs to the community itself. But how can you help your community if you cannot even help yourself? That's where the predicament is in African collectivism. And what sparks me is that Africa, at the end of the day, is culturally a collectivist culture, but spiritually it's quite individualistic. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but the Africans who follow this video understand what I'm saying. Culturally, we are collective or collectivist, but spiritually, we're not collectivist at all. Ladies and gentlemen, that was my presentation of the day for Classical Liberalism in Africa, a Manifesto. This book is available on Amazon.com, so please get your copy whenever you can. It's a very enlightening book for anyone that is truly interested in learning about African political culture and how classical liberalism could help Africa thrive as a whole. This book is for you, so please do not hesitate to get it online and let me know what you think of it. Have a good day.